Richard Holt sat alone in his glass-walled office on the 50th floor of Holt Energy Tower, the relentless glow of New York City spilling across his desk like liquid gold. The skyline stretched before him, sharp, jagged, unyielding, much like the man he'd become. At 58, he was a titan of industry, a CEO whose name carried the weight of a billion-dollar empire built on discipline and sacrifice. Yet the room felt hollow, the hum of the city below a distant echo against the silence of his solitude. His tie was still knotted tight, his suit pristine even at this late hour, a testament to the iron control he wielded over his life. But control, he'd learned, came at a cost. The office was a cathedral of glass and steel, its sleek lines and polished surfaces reflecting the man who occupied it. A mahogany desk dominated the space, its edges sharp enough to cut, cluttered only with a single leather-bound notebook and a Mont Blanc pen, a gift from a board member he barely remembered. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan never faded, a constellation of ambition that mirrored his own. He'd spent decades climbing to this perch, each step a calculated move, each decision a brick in the fortress of his legacy. And yet, tonight, the view felt less like a triumph and more like a cage. The door clicked open, a soft intrusion that snapped his gaze from the horizon. Ellen Carter, his new assistant, stepped in, her arms full of files and her face etched with the quiet resilience of someone who'd learned to carry more than her share. She was 35, sharp-eyed and steady, with a presence that didn't beg for attention but commanded it nonetheless. Behind her trailed a small figure, her son Ben, a 4-year-old bundle of energy in a worn jacket and sneakers that squeaked against the polished floor. Richard's brow furrowed. This wasn't part of the plan. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holt," Ellen said, her voice even but tinged with strain as she set the files on a side table. "The preschool shut down early, some plumbing issue. I didn't have anyone else to watch him." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. "This isn't a daycare, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone measured, each word clipped like a blade. He didn't raise his voice. Never did. Control was his armor and he wore it well. "I know, sir," Ellen replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It won't happen again. I'll keep him quiet." Her eyes, dark and steady, held a flicker of defiance. Not loud, not brash, but there all the same. She turned to Ben, kneeling to adjust his jacket. "Stay close, okay, buddy?" "Mommy's working," Ben nodded, his small hands clutching a battered toy car, but his curiosity got the better of him. He darted forward, weaving past his mother's reach and clambered onto the edge of Richard's desk. Before Ellen could react, a glass of water teetered and fell, splashing across a stack of quarterly reports. The sound was sharp, a crack against the stillness, and Richard's jaw tightened. "Ben!" Ellen lunged, pulling the boy back, her face paling as she grabbed a tissue from her purse to dab at the mess. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll clean it up." Richard didn't move. His hands rested on the armrests of his chair, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the spreading stain. A lesser man might have snapped, shouted, berated her for the disruption. But Richard Holt wasn't that man. He exhaled slowly, a deliberate release of tension, and waved a hand. "Leave it," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "Just take him to the corner. I have a call in 10 minutes. Ellen nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she guided Ben to a chair near the window. "Sit here, sweetheart," she murmured, smoothing his hair with a tenderness that felt out of place in this sterile room. Ben obeyed, swinging his legs as he rolled the toy car along the armrest, oblivious to the storm he'd nearly unleashed. Richard watched them from the corner of his eye, his focus split between the reports and the scene unfolding across the room. Ellen's quiet efficiency as she settled Ben stirred something in him, a memory, faint and unbidden, of another woman, another time. Laura Evans. 30 years ago, she'd stood before him with that same steady gaze, her voice soft but unyielding as she'd begged him to stay. "We can make it work, Richard," she'd said, her hand resting on her stomach, the promise of a child between them. But he'd walked away, choosing a contract with Holt Energy over a life he wasn't ready to claim. The memory clawed at. Him now, sharp and persistent, and he pushed it down, locking it behind the wall he'd built around his heart. But then Ben looked up, catching Richard's stare. The boy grinned, a wide, unguarded smile that lit his face like a beacon, and something in Richard cracked. Those eyes, that smile, they were Laura's. Not a vague resemblance, but a mirror, a living echo of the woman he'd left behind. His chest tightened, a pang he couldn't name, and for a moment the room tilted. He blinked, forcing his gaze back to the damp papers, but the image lingered, searing itself into his mind. "Mr. Holt?" Ellen's voice broke through, tentative but firm. She stood by the files again, her hands clasped. "The call with Tokyo is ready. Should I patch it through?" He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes. Do it." His tone was steady, but his fingers gripped the pen a little too hard, the metal cool against his palm. As Ellen moved to the console, Richard glanced at Ben once more. The boy was humming softly, lost in his own world. And the sound, innocent, unguarded, cut deeper than any accusation ever could. The lights of the city stretched on outside, unblinking, unwavering. They never faded, just like the choices Richard had made, the ones that had brought him here, to this tower, this life, this solitude. But tonight, for the first time in decades, a shadow of doubt crept in. What had he sacrificed to keep those lights burning? And why did the sight of a child's smile feel like a question he couldn't answer? The hum of the Holt Energy Tower was a constant companion, a low pulse that thrummed through the steel and glass like the heartbeat of a machine. Richard Holt sat at his desk, the Tokyo call now a memory, its details fading into the orderly chaos of his mind. The damp reports from the night before had been replaced with crisp new copies, the evidence of Ben's small chaos erased as if it had never happened. But erasure was a lie Richard couldn't sell himself, not tonight. The boy's smile lingered, a ghost in the corner of his vision, and with it came the echo of Laura Evans, a woman he'd buried beneath decades of ambition. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and let his gaze drift to the far end of the office. There, in a quiet corner near the window, Ben Carter sat cross-legged on the floor, a small island of innocence in a sea of corporate precision. The boy had claimed the space over the past few days, turning it into a makeshift sanctuary with a handful of colored pencils and a beat-up toy car Ellen had pulled from her bag. Richard hadn't protested, not aloud at least. Ellen was efficient, her work flawless despite the distraction, and he'd let it slide, telling himself it was practicality, not sentiment, that stayed his hand. Now, as the clock ticked past 8, Ben was engrossed in his world, rolling the toy car along invisible roads, his lips moving in a soft, tuneless hum. Ellen sat nearby, her laptop balanced on her knees, her fingers tapping out emails with a rhythm that spoke of quiet determination. She glanced at Ben every few minutes, a quick check to ensure he was still there, still safe. It was a gesture Richard recognized, not from his own life, but from a memory he'd tried to forget. Laura had done the same, her eyes always finding him in a crowded room, a silent promise of care he'd never returned. He shifted in his seat, the thought prickling like a splinter under his skin. 30 years ago, Laura had stood in his cramped apartment, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can make it work, Richard," she'd said, her hand resting on the faint curve of her stomach. "You don't have to choose." But he had chosen. Holt, Energy, a fledgling contract, a chance to prove himself against James Vaughn, the rival who'd mocked his small-town roots. He'd walked out, leaving her tears behind, convinced that success would silence the guilt. It hadn't. The office door swung open, and Richard straightened, his mask of control sliding back into place. Ellen looked up, her fingers pausing mid-keystroke, as Ben scrambled to his feet, clutching his car. He darted across the room, his sneakers squeaking, and stopped at Richard's desk, holding up a crumpled sheet of paper. "Look," he chirped, his voice bright against the sterile air. "I drew your building." Richard stared at the drawing, jagged lines in blue and red, a child's version of the tower complete with a stick figure man at the top. Him, he realized with a jolt. He opened his mouth to dismiss it, to send the boy back to his corner. But Ben's eyes stopped him, wide, clear, and impossibly familiar. Laura's eyes, peering out from a face too young to carry her shadow. His throat tightened, and he forced his hands to stay still, resisting the urge to push the paper away. "Ben, come back here," Ellen called, her tone firm but gentle as she rose from her chair. She crossed the room in quick strides, kneeling beside her son. "Mr. Holt's busy, okay? Let's not bother him." "It's fine," Richard said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice was steady, but his chest felt hollow, as if something had shifted inside him. Ellen hesitated, her brow furrowing, then nodded, guiding Ben back to the corner. As they retreated, Richard kept the drawing in his peripheral vision, its childish lines a silent accusation. He turned to his computer, pulling up a contract to review, but the words blurred. Ellen's voice broke the silence, low and measured, as she answered a call. "Yes, I'll have the files ready by morning," she said, then paused. "No, I don't mind staying late. I grew up figuring things out on my own. My mom didn't have much choice after my dad left." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but the weight of it landed like a stone in Richard's gut. He glanced at her again, studying the lines of her face, the high cheekbones, the determined set of her jaw. She wasn't Laura, not exactly, but there was something there, a thread he couldn't unsee. And Ben, those eyes, that smile, carried a piece of her too. A piece of him? The thought struck hard, a possibility he'd never allowed himself to consider. He'd assumed Laura had moved on, built a life without him. But what if she hadn't? What if Ellen was... No. He shut the thought down, his fingers tightening around the pen until the metal bit into his palm. He wouldn't jump to conclusions. Not yet. Richard Holt didn't act on impulse. He gathered facts, weighed options, maintained control. That was how he'd survived, how he'd built this empire. But as he watched Ellen tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so like Laura's it stole his breath, the cracks in his armor widened. "Ellen," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. She looked up, startled. "Why do you bring him here? There must be someone else. A neighbor, a friend." Her eyes met his, unflinching. "There isn't," she said simply. "I don't trust strangers with him. My mom raised me alone after she was left behind, and I learned early that you only count on yourself." She paused, then added softer, "Ben's all I have." Richard nodded, his expression impassive. But inside, a storm brewed. Left behind. The words echoed, sharp and accusing, dragging him back to that apartment, to Laura's tear-streaked face. He'd walked away to protect his future, to shield himself from failure. But what had he left in his wake? The toy car rolled across the floor again, its wheels a faint whisper against the silence. Ben hummed, oblivious, and Richard felt the weight of 30 years settle on his shoulders. Not anger, not regret, but a quiet, piercing question. What had his control cost him? And why did this child, this stranger, feel like a mirror to a past he couldn't outrun? The Holt Energy Tower slept under a shroud of midnight silence, its gleaming facade a stark contrast to the chaos stirring in Richard Holt's mind. He hadn't stayed late tonight, not for work, not for the endless grind that had defined his life. Instead, he'd driven to his Upper East Side mansion, a sprawling monument of marble and solitude that stood as cold and unyielding as the man who owned it. The office had rattled him, Ben's smile, Ellen's words, and he needed answers, something tangible to anchor the doubt gnawing at his core. He descended the spiral staircase to the basement, the air thick with the scent of dust and old paper. The space was a mausoleum of his past, boxes of contracts, faded photographs, relics of a life he'd buried beneath ambition. Richard rarely came here. It was a place for things forgotten, not revisited. But tonight he moved with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete as he scanned the shelves. His fingers brushed a metal file box, its label yellowed with age. Personal Correspondence, 1990s. He pulled it down, the weight heavier than he'd expected, and carried it to a small table under a flickering bulb. The lid creaked as he opened it, revealing a jumble of envelopes and notes, the detritus of a younger Richard Holt, a man who'd once dreamed beyond boardrooms. He sifted through the papers, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. Bills, thank you notes, a postcard from a college friend, nothing significant, until he saw it. A plain white envelope, its edges worn, addressed in a looping script he hadn't seen in 30 years. Laura's handwriting. His breath caught, a sharp intake that echoed in the stillness. He slid the letter free, the paper, fragile under his fingers, and unfolded it with care, as if it might crumble at his touch. The date at the top, March 15, 1995, stared back at him, a timestamp from a life he'd abandoned. His eyes traced the words, each one a blade sinking deeper. Richard, I know you're building something big and I'm proud of you. But I'm scared. I'm pregnant. Our daughter's coming in September. I don't have much, but I'll manage. If you'll help, please don't shut me out. We can still be a family. Call me, Laura. Beneath the plea, a phone number was scrawled, long since disconnected. Tucked into the envelope was a smaller note, written in a different hand. His old assistant's, a man he'd fired years ago for incompetence. Hid this per your orders, it read. Didn't want it distracting you from the Vaughn deal. Richard sank onto the cold floor, the letter slipping from his fingers to rest against his knee. His orders? He hadn't known, hadn't seen this, hadn't told anyone to hide it. Or had he? The memory was a fog, clouded by the frenetic pace of those early days at Holt Energy. He'd been 28, ruthless, obsessed with outpacing. James Vaughn, the rival who'd taunted him at every turn. Had he brushed off Laura's calls, delegated her letters to an assistant with a vague command to handle it? The possibility clawed at him, a truth he couldn't deny. He pressed a hand to his forehead, his palm clammy against the lines etched deep by time. Laura had reached out, begged him, and he'd left her dangling, alone with a child he'd never acknowledged. Their daughter, Ellen. The name clicked into place like a key turning in a lock, and the weight of it crushed him. He pictured her now, those steady eyes, that quiet strength, and saw Laura in every line of her face. And Ben, those eyes, that smile, carried the blood he'd ignored. The bulb flickered above, casting shadows that danced across the concrete, and Richard's gaze fell to the letter again. He picked it up, his fingers trembling now. No longer the steady hands of a man in control. Laura hadn't cursed him, hadn't raged. She'd asked for help, for family, and he'd given her silence. What had happened after? He stood, the box forgotten, and moved to his study upstairs, the letter clutched like a lifeline. His laptop glowed to life, and with a few keystrokes, he searched for Laura Evans, birth records, obituaries, anything. The screen filled with fragments, an obituary from 2005, a small notice in a local paper. Laura Evans, 38, passed away in a Brooklyn hospital after a long illness, survived by her daughter, Ellen Carter. No mention of a father. The words blurred as his eyes stung, a rare crack in the wall he'd built around his emotions. She'd died alone, poor, raising Ellen in a world he'd refused to enter. And Ellen, his daughter, had grown up without him, carrying the burden of a mother's loss and a father's absence. Richard closed the laptop, his breath shallow. He crossed to the window, staring out at the city's endless lights, but they offered no comfort now. The man who'd built an empire on discipline and control felt powerless, stripped bare by a single sheet of paper. His mind raced, Ellen's voice, her casual mention of a father who'd left, a mother who'd taught her to stand alone. She didn't know, did she? Or did she? The doubt gnawed at him, a challenge to the honor he'd prided himself on. He could confront her, demand answers, unravel the truth. But he didn't. Richard Holt didn't act on impulse. He calculated. He waited. He'd spent a lifetime mastering himself, and he wouldn't lose that now, not when the stakes were this high. Yet as he stood there, the letter burning a hole in his pocket, he felt the first stirrings of something new. Not anger, not shame, but a quiet, resolute need. To know, to face what he'd done, to reclaim the dignity he'd traded for success. The basement door stood open behind him, a dark maw leading back to the past. Richard turned away, his shadow long against the floor. He wouldn't sleep tonight, not with Laura's words echoing in his head, not with Ellen's face haunting his thoughts. The lights of the city stretched on, unyielding, but for the first time, they felt dim against the shadow of a truth he could no longer outrun. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria shimmered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 glints across the polished floor. Richard Holt stood near the edge of the crowd, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, the amber liquid catching the glow like a captive flame. The Holt Energy Annual Gala was a spectacle of power. Black ties, designer gowns, the low hum of deals being struck over caviar and champagne. It was his domain, a world he'd mastered with precision and poise. But tonight, the weight of Laura's letter pressed against his chest, a secret folded into the pocket of his tailored tuxedo, and the room felt less like a throne, and more like a stage set for judgment. He scanned the sea of faces, board members, investors, the press, all orbiting him like planets around a star. Yet his focus narrowed as a familiar figure cut through the throng, his stride deliberate, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. James Vaughn. The man hadn't aged so much as hardened, his silver hair swept back, his eyes glinting with the same ruthless ambition that had fueled their rivalry 30 years ago. Once a friend, then a foe, James had built Vaughn Enterprises into a titan of its own, always nipping at Richard's heels, always waiting for a stumble. "Richard," James said, his voice smooth as velvet but laced with venom. He raised his glass in a mock toast, the flash of cameras catching the gesture. "Another year at the top. How do you manage it?" Richard met his gaze, his own expression a mask of calm. "Discipline," he replied, his tone even, betraying nothing. "Something you've always struggled with, James." The jab landed, and James's smile tightened, a flicker of old resentment surfacing. They'd been young once, scrappy entrepreneurs clawing their way up, until Laura came between them. She'd chosen Richard, his quiet resolve over James's brash charm, and James had never forgiven it. When Richard walked away from her, James had crowed about it, calling him a coward behind closed doors. Now, standing here in the glow of success, Richard felt the sting of that taunt anew. "You look distracted tonight," James said, swirling his drink. "Trouble in paradise? Or is it that assistant of yours? Ellen, isn't it? She's been turning heads." His tone was casual, but his eyes were predatory, searching for a crack. Richard's grip on the glass tightened, the cold crystal biting into his palm, but he didn't flinch. "She's competent," he said, keeping his voice steady. "That's all that matters." He wouldn't rise to the bait, not here, not now. Control was his shield, and he wielded it with the precision of a surgeon. James chuckled, a low grating sound. "Competent, sure. But I hear she's got a kid trailing her around your office. Hardly the image of a Holt Energy executive, is it? People talk, Richard. They wonder what's going on up there on the 50th floor." The words were a dagger, aimed at the heart of Richard's carefully curated world. He felt the heat of eyes on him, the reporters hovering nearby, the board members whispering over their drinks. James was fishing, testing him, and Richard knew it. Ellen's presence, Ben's presence, hadn't gone unnoticed, and now his rival was circling, scenting blood. But Richard didn't falter. He tilted his head, a faint smile playing at his lips, the kind that promised steel beneath the surface. "Let them talk," he said. "Gossip doesn't build empires. Results do." He took a measured sip of scotch, the burn grounding him, and set the glass on a passing tray. "Enjoy the party, James. You've earned it." He turned to walk away, but James's voice followed, sharp and deliberate. "You can't hide forever, Richard. Sooner or later the past catches up, and when it does, I'll be there to watch you fall." Richard paused, his back to James, his shoulders squared. The threat hung in the air, a promise wrapped in malice, but he didn't turn. He wouldn't give James the satisfaction. Instead, he moved toward the balcony doors, the cool night air a welcome reprieve from the suffocating opulence inside. The city stretched out below, its lights a relentless pulse, and he leaned against the railing, Laura's letter crinkling in his pocket. James knew something, or suspected it. Richard's mind raced, piecing together the threat. Vaughn Enterprises had been losing ground lately, its stock dipping while Holt Energy soared. James needed a win, a scandal to tip the scales, and Ellen and Ben were the perfect leverage. Richard had seen the reports. James employed private investigators, men who dug into lives like vultures picking at carrion. If James found proof, Laura's connection, Ellen's parentage, he'd wield it like a weapon, not just to hurt Richard, but to destroy him. The realization settled like a stone in his gut, but Richard didn't panic. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, the city's hum steadying him. He'd faced James before, outmaneuvered him, outlasted him, and he'd do it again. But this wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal, a reckoning with a past he couldn't erase. Ellen was his daughter. He was certain now, the letter a silent scream of truth. And Ben was his grandson. They were his, and James would use them to tear down everything he'd built. He opened his eyes, his jaw set. He wouldn't let that happen, not out of pride, but out of a duty he'd ignored too long. The man who'd walked away from Laura 30 years ago wasn't the man standing here now. That Richard had been driven by fear, of failure, of vulnerability. This Richard was older, harder, but not beyond redemption. He'd protect Ellen and Ben, not with anger or fists, but with the quiet strength he'd honed over decades. The gala's noise drifted through the doors, laughter, clinking glasses, the flash of cameras. Richard straightened, smoothing his jacket, the letter a weight he carried willingly. James could threaten all he wanted, but Richard wouldn't break. He'd built his life on control, on dignity, and he'd face this storm the same way, not with rage, but with resolve. The past was catching up, just as James had promised, but Richard wouldn't run, not this time. He stepped back into the light, the rival's shadow lurking behind him, and prepared for the fight he'd never seen coming. Rain streaked the floor to ceiling, windows of the Holt Energy boardroom, a gray curtain that blurred the city into a watercolor haze. Richard Holt stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette sharp against the storm outside. The room was empty save for Ellen Carter, who sat across from him, her posture rigid, her dark eyes fixed on the polished wood. The air between them crackled with unspoken weight. 30 years of silence condensed into this moment, a reckoning neither had sought but neither could avoid. He'd asked her to stay after hours, a request delivered. With the same measured calm he used in every board meeting, she'd agreed, though her hesitation lingered in the way she'd paused at the door, Ben's small backpack slung over her shoulder. The boy was with a co-worker now, safe in the break room with a juice box and a coloring book, but his absence didn't lighten the tension. Richard had Laura's letter in his pocket, its edges worn from days of restless handling, and it burned against his chest like a brand. "Ellen," he began, his voice low, deliberate, as if testing the waters of a frozen lake. "I need to ask you about your mother." Her head snapped up, her gaze narrowing, but she didn't speak. The rain drummed a steady rhythm, filling the silence, and Richard pressed on, each word a step into uncharted territory. "Her name was Laura Evans, wasn't it?" Ellen's fingers tightened around the armrests of her chair, her knuckles paling. "What's this about, Mr. Holt?" she asked, her tone guarded, a wall rising brick by brick. She wasn't his assistant now. She was a woman protecting something fragile, something he'd already glimpsed in the depths of her resilience. He pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolding it with care, and laid it on the table between them. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, a betrayal of the control he clung to, but his face remained steady. "I found this," he said. "It's from her. To me. 30 years ago." Ellen stared at the letter, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting, the looping script of a mother she'd lost too soon. She didn't reach for it, didn't move, but her eyes traced the words, and Richard saw the flicker of realization dawn. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, edged with steel. "You're him, aren't you? The man who left her." The accusation landed like a blow, but Richard didn't flinch. He'd prepared for this, steeled himself against the truth he'd unearthed in the basement shadows. Yes, he said simply, meeting her gaze. I'm your father. The word hung in the air, heavy and raw, a bridge he'd burned long ago now trembling under the weight of its reconstruction. Ellen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and turned to the window, her back to him. Rain lashed the glass, a mirror to the storm in her eyes, and for a moment, Richard thought she might walk out, leave him with his confession and his guilt. I didn't know, he continued, his voice softer now but firm. Not until I found that letter. She wrote to me, asked for help, and I never saw it. Someone hid it. My assistant, under my orders, I suppose. I was young, ambitious, afraid. I walked away from her, from you, and I've carried that choice every day since. Ellen turned, her arms crossed, her face a mask of pain and defiance. You didn't know, she echoed, her voice rising, though it never broke. She waited for you, Mr. Holt. She worked double shifts at a diner, slept in a one-room apartment, with me crying all night, and waited. She got sick, cancer, and still believed you'd come back. She died alone in a hospital bed because you didn't know. Her words cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal, each one a shard of glass piercing. The armor of his self-control. Richard felt the urge to look away, to retreat, but he held her gaze, his jaw tight. I can't change what I did, he said. I can't undo her suffering, or yours. But I'm here now, Ellen. I want to make it right. She laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed in the empty room. Make it right? For who? Me? Ben? Or you, so you can sleep better at night? She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. I've spent my life building something for my son, something solid, something you'll never understand. I don't need, you, and Ben doesn't either. You chose your empire over us once. You don't get to waltz back in now. Richard didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He stood still, absorbing her anger like a penance, his hands steady at his sides. I'm not here to force anything, he said. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. Not yet. But you deserve the truth, and Ben deserves a future without the shadows I left behind. Ellen shook her head, tears brimming but not falling, her strength a fortress he couldn't breach. The truth doesn't change anything, she said. You're still the man who walked away. I grew up in those shadows, and I learned to stand in them without you. Ben won't know that life. Not because of you, but because of me. She grabbed her bag from the table, her movements sharp, and headed for the door. Richard stepped forward, instinct urging him to stop her, but he caught himself. Ellen, he called, his voice quiet but resolute. I won't push you, but I'm not walking away again. Not this time. She paused, her hand on the doorknob but didn't turn. Keep your promises to yourself, Mr. Holt, she said, her voice a whisper against the rain. I've heard them before. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Richard alone with the letter and the storm. He sank into a chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him, but he didn't crumble. His hands rested on the table, steady despite the ache in his chest. He'd faced her rejection with dignity, not desperation, and that was a start. The past was a wound he couldn't heal, but the future, Ellen's, Ben's, was still within reach. He wouldn't force it, wouldn't beg. He'd prove it, step by step, with the quiet resolve that had built his life, and now perhaps could rebuild it. The rain continued its relentless dance, washing the city clean. But Richard knew some stains ran too deep to fade. The press room on the ground floor of Holt Energy Tower buzzed with a restless energy, a swarm of reporters poised like vultures over a fresh kill. Richard Holt stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on its edges, his face an unreadable mask of calm. Above him, a massive screen flickered to life, casting a harsh glow across the room. The headline screamed in bold, CEO Richard, Holt's secret family exposed. Beneath it, grainy photos flashed, Laura Evans in her youth, Ellen Carter at her desk, Ben clutching his toy car. The air thickened with whispers, camera shutters snapping like gunfire, but Richard didn't. Blink James Vaughn had made good on his threat. The gala's taunts had been a prelude, a spark to this blaze now consuming Richard's carefully constructed world. The story had broken that morning, leaked emails, a copy of Laura's letter, Ellen's birth certificate, all woven into a damning narrative of abandonment and deceit. The board had called an emergency meeting, shareholders were in panic, and the stock ticker in the corner of the screen bled red. But Richard wasn't here to defend his empire. He was here for something greater. He adjusted the microphone, the faint hum grounding him, and the room fell silent. Every eye locked on the man who'd built Holt Energy from nothing. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady, resonant, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You've all seen the reports. I won't waste your time with denials or excuses. What you've read is true." A gasp rippled through the crowd, pens scratching furiously, but Richard pressed on, his gaze unwavering. 30 years ago, I walked away from Laura Evans, a woman I loved, a woman carrying my child. I didn't know she'd reached out, didn't know her letter was hidden from me until days ago. But that doesn't absolve me. I made a choice, my career over my family, and I've lived with the consequences ever since. The screen shifted, showing Ellen now, her face pale as she stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes wide, with shock. She'd come at Richard's request, expecting a private resolution, not this public unraveling. Beside her, a co-worker held Ben, who clutched his car, oblivious to the storm around him. Richard met Ellen's gaze, a silent apology in his eyes, but he didn't falter. "Ellen Carter is my daughter," he said, the words ringing out with a quiet force. "Ben is my grandson. I didn't raise them, didn't protect them, and for that I bear the blame, but I won't let them pay for my mistakes, not anymore." The room erupted, shouts, questions, flashes blinding, but Richard raised a hand, silencing them with the authority he'd honed over decades. "I'm not here to save my reputation," he continued. "I'm here to take responsibility. Holt Energy will weather this storm, or it won't. That's for the board to decide. But my honor isn't tied to a stock price or a corner office. It's tied to them, to Ellen, to Ben, and to the truth I've owed them for too long." He stepped back from the podium and reached into the shadows beside him, pulling out a small wooden chair. Ben's chair, the one from the office corner, its paint chipped and legs wobbly. He placed it beside the sleek podium, a stark contrast to the polished grandeur of the room, and rested a hand on its back. "This belongs to my grandson," he said, his voice softening but firm. "It's where he sits when he's with me. And it's where I'll start rebuilding what I broke, not with words, but with actions." The reporters surged forward, a tide of noise and light, but Richard didn't move. He stood beside the chair, his posture straight, his expression serene, despite the chaos. Ellen stared at him, her face a war of emotions, anger, disbelief, a flicker of something softer. She hadn't expected this. Not the confession, not the chair, not the man who'd chosen silence over excuses now laying himself bare before the world. From the sidelines, James Vaughn watched, his smirk faltering. He'd anticipated a fight, denials, counterattacks, the Richard Holt he'd known for decades clawing to protect his throne. Instead, Richard had surrendered it, not with weakness, but with a strength James couldn't comprehend. The room tilted in Richard's favor, the narrative shifting from scandal to sacrifice, and James's triumph slipped through his fingers like sand. "Mr. Holt," a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone forward. "Are you resigning? What does this mean for Holt Energy?" Richard looked at the man, then at Ellen, and finally at Ben, who waved shyly from the back. "It means I'm done running," he said, his voice clear above the din. "I've spent 30 years building something I thought mattered. But this," he gestured to the chair, to Ellen and Ben, "this is what lasts. I'll face whatever comes next, but I won't hide from it." He stepped away from the podium, the chair standing alone as a silent testament, and walked toward Ellen. The crowd parted, cameras trailing him, but he ignored them. She didn't move as he approached, her arms still crossed, her eyes searching his. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice low, trembling with a mix of fury and confusion. "You could have kept it quiet." I could've, Richard replied, his tone gentle but resolute. But you deserve more than secrets, Ellen. Ben deserves more. I won't force you to accept me, but I won't let James, or anyone, use you against me. This ends now. She didn't respond. Her jaw tight, but her gaze softened just for a moment before she turned to scoop Ben into her arms. Richard watched them go, the boy's small hand waving over her shoulder, and felt a weight lift. Not fully, not yet, but enough to breathe. The press swarmed again, questions flying, but he walked through them, his steps steady, his head high. The storm outside had eased, the rain a soft patter against the glass, but inside, a different tempest raged. Richard had lost control of his empire, stock plummeting, bored in chaos, but he'd reclaimed something else, a shred of dignity, a chance at redemption. James had wanted a fall, Richard had given him a stand. And in that empty chair, he'd planted a seed, not of power, but of purpose. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a damp chill that seeped through the cracked windows of Ellen Carter's Brooklyn apartment. Richard Holt stood in the narrow hallway, his tailored coat out of place against the peeling paint and flickering, fluorescent light overhead. The call had come an hour ago. Ellen's voice, tight with panic, cutting through the static of his phone. Ben's sick. I don't know what else to do. He'd left the chaos of Holt Energy Tower behind without a second thought, the board's demands and the plummeting stock ticker fading into irrelevance. Now, here he was, stepping into a world he'd never known, a stranger in his daughter's life. Ellen opened the door wider, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She didn't invite him in, not with words, but she stepped aside, and Richard took it as permission. The apartment was small, cluttered with the evidence of a life carved from resilience. A sagging couch, a kitchen table piled with bills, a scattering of Ben's toys across the floor. In the corner, a twin bed held the boy, his small frame curled. Under a thin blanket, his breath shallow and ragged. He's been coughing all day, Ellen said, her voice low as she hovered near the bed. It got worse after everything. The press, the cameras, they chased us out of the building. He was soaked by the time we got home. She rubbed her arms, as if warding off the cold, and shot Richard a glance, half accusation, half plea. Richard set his coat on a chair and crossed to the bed, kneeling beside Ben. The boy's forehead burned under his palm, a fever that pulsed with every labored breath. A cough rattled through him, sharp and wet, and Richard's chest tightened. Pneumonia, maybe, brought on by the rain, the stress, the fallout of his public confession. He'd exposed them to this, and now Ben paid the price. There's a towel. In the bathroom, Ellen said, her tone clipped, and a bowl on the counter. I've been trying to cool him down, but... She trailed off, her hands twisting together, a rare crack in her armor. Richard nodded, rising to fetch the items. The bathroom was cramped, the sink stained with rust, but he found the towel, a faded blue thing, soft from years of use, and dampened it under the tap. Back at Ben's side, he pressed it gently to the boy's forehead, wiping away the sweat. That beaded there. Ben stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and offered a weak smile. Hi, he rasped, his voice a whisper. Hi, Ben, Richard replied, his own voice softening, a warmth he hadn't known he possessed. You're going to be okay. I'm here now. Ellen watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Richard kept his focus on Ben, dipping the towel again, his movement steady despite the ache in his knees from the hard floor. He began to speak, low and calm, the words spilling out unbidden. Your grandma Laura, she loved stories. She'd sit with me on her porch, telling me about stars and rivers. She had a voice like music, Ben. I think you've got it too. Ben's eyes widened, a flicker of curiosity breaking through the haze of fever. Did she sing? He asked, his cough punctuating the question. She did, Richard said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Badly, sometimes, but it didn't matter. It made her happy. He glanced at Ellen, catching the softening in her gaze, a memory shared across the gulf between them. The hours slipped by, marked by the tick of a cheap clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the building settling. Richard stayed beside Ben, refreshing the towel, adjusting the blanket, his presence a quiet anchor. Ellen moved between the kitchen and the bed, brewing tea she didn't drink, her silence a shield. At midnight, Ben's breathing eased, the fever breaking under their vigil, and he drifted into a deeper sleep. Ellen sank onto the couch, her shoulders slumping, and Richard joined her, keeping a respectful distance. The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the room, softening the edges of their exhaustion. "You didn't have to come," she said finally, her voice raw. "I could have handled it." "I know," Richard replied, his hands resting on his knees, steady as ever. "But I wanted to. Not to fix things, not yet, but to be here. I've missed too much already." She looked at him then, really looked, her eyes searching his face for the man she'd never known. "That press conference," she said. "You threw everything away, your company, your reputation. Why?" Richard exhaled, the question cutting to the core of him. "Because it wasn't mine to keep," he said. "Not at your expense or Ben's. I built Holt Energy on discipline, on control, but I lost sight of what mattered. I couldn't let James turn you into a weapon against me. I had to take that power away from him and from myself." Ellen's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. "It's not forgiveness," she said after a pause. "Not yet. But I won't stop Ben from knowing you, if that's what he wants." Richard nodded, accepting the boundary with the dignity he'd fought to reclaim. "That's enough," he said. "For now, it's enough." He stood retrieving his coat but paused at the door. "I'm stepping down," he said, turning to her. "The board will vote tomorrow, but it's done. I've sold the mansion. Too. Most of it's going to a fund for kids like Ben, kids who need a chance. I'll be close by, Ellen. Not to push, but to stay." She didn't respond, but her eyes held his, a flicker of something, respect maybe, passing between them. Richard stepped into the hall, the door clicking shut behind him, and descended the stairs into the night. The city was quiet now, its lights muted by the late hour, but a new light burned within him. Not bright, not triumphant, but steady, like a candle at midnight. He'd lost an empire, but he'd gained a purpose. Ben's cough, Ellen's guarded trust. They were threads to a future he could still weave, not with power, but with presence. For the first time in decades, Richard Holt felt the weight of his choices lift, replaced by a resolve as unyielding as the man he'd always been. The late afternoon sun filtered through the smudged glass of Ellen Carter's Brooklyn apartment, casting a warm glow across the worn wooden floor. Richard Holt sat on a stool beside the kitchen table, a small screwdriver in his hand, his sleeves rolled up past his elbows. Across from him, Ben perched on a cushion, his tongue poking out in concentration as he handed Richard a tiny wheel from his battered toy car. "This one's wobbly," the boy said, his voice bright despite the faint rasp lingering from his illness. "Can you fix it, Grandpa?" Richard paused, the word, Grandpa, hitting him like a quiet thunderclap. It had slipped from Ben's lips a week ago, unprompted, natural as breathing, and every time since it settled deeper into Richard's bones. He smiled, a rare, unguarded curve of his lips, and took the wheel. "I'll give it a try," he said, his voice steady but warm, threading the screw with a care he'd once reserved for billion-dollar deals. A year had passed since the press conference, since the storm that had toppled his empire and reshaped his life. Holt Energy had survived, barely under new leadership, its stock clawing back from the brink, but Richard was no longer its titan. He'd walked away, selling the Upper East Side mansion and most of his fortune to seed the Laura Evans Fund, a quiet legacy for kids like Ben, kids who needed books, medicine, a chance at something better. He'd kept a modest brownstone a few blocks from Ellen's place, close enough to be present, far enough to respect her boundaries. The apartment hummed with small sounds, Ellen stirring a pot of soup on the stove, the clink of a spoon against metal, the soft patter of rain starting again outside. She'd invited him over today, a simple "come for dinner" texted without fanfare. But it was a milestone, a thread of trust woven into the fabric of their fragile bond. Richard didn't push, he never did, but he showed up every time, with the patience of a man who'd learned the value of waiting. Ben slid off the cushion and ran to the window, pressing his nose against the glass. "Look, Grandpa, the rain's making patterns," he called, his breath fogging the pain. Richard set the toy car down, its wheel now secure, and joined him, placing the small chair, Ben's chair, the one from the press room, beside the sill. He lifted the boy onto it, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder, and together they watched the droplets race down the glass. "It's like a race," Richard said, pointing to a bead of water streaking ahead. "See? That one's winning." Ben giggled, leaning into him, and Richard felt a pang. Not regret, not anymore, but gratitude. This was what he'd missed with Ellen, what he'd denied Laura. These quiet moments, the weight of a child's trust. He'd spent decades chasing power, believing it defined him, but here, in this cramped room with a 4-year-old's laughter, he found a dignity money couldn't buy. Ellen approached, a steaming bowl of soup in her hands, and set it on the table. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice soft but firm, the edge of wariness dulled by time. She glanced at the chair, then at Richard, her eyes lingering. "You're good with him," she added, almost reluctantly, as if the admission cost her something. "He makes it easy," Richard replied, guiding Ben to the table. He didn't press her words, didn't ask for more. Ellen wasn't ready to call him father, might never be, and he accepted that with the same resolve he'd brought to every boardroom. What mattered was this: the soup, the chair, the boy who now climbed into his lap without hesitation. They ate in companionable silence, the clink of spoons and Ben's chatter filling the space. Richard savored the simplicity. Chicken broth, a hint of time, the kind of meal Laura might have made if he'd stayed. He'd lost her, lost years, with Ellen, but he hadn't lost this. Not yet. Not if he kept showing up. After dinner, Ellen cleared the dishes while Richard helped Ben with a drawing. A lopsided version of the brownstone, complete with a stick figure Grandpa waving from the door. "That's you," Ben said, pointing proudly, and Richard's throat tightened. He ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture that felt more natural each time, and glanced at Ellen. She was watching from the sink, her hands still in the soapy water, her expression unreadable, but not cold. "I heard about the fund," she said finally, drying her hands on a towel. "They're opening a clinic in Queens next month, named after her, Mom." Richard nodded, setting the crayon down. "It's what she'd have wanted," he said. "A place for kids to get help, for mothers like her, like you, to not feel alone. I should have done it sooner." Ellen crossed her arms, a habit he'd come to recognize as her shield, but her voice softened. "You didn't have to give it all up. The company, the house. You could have fought James, kept your seat." "I could have," Richard agreed, meeting her gaze. "But it wasn't worth it, not if it meant losing you again or Ben. James wanted a war. I gave him a surrender he couldn't use. Honor isn't in the fight, Ellen. It's in knowing when to let go." She didn't respond, but her eyes held his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. James Vaughn had faded into obscurity, his victory hollow without Richard's resistance, while the Laura Evans Fund grew, its quiet impact a rebuke to his rival's ambition. Richard had lost an empire, but he'd built something lasting, not with power, but with purpose. Ben yawned, curling against him, and Ellen stepped forward. "Time for bed," she said, lifting the boy from Richard's lap. She paused, then added, "You can stay a bit, if you want." Richard nodded, a quiet victory in her offer. He moved the chair back to the window, sitting beside it as Ellen tucked Ben in, her voice a murmur of a lullaby Laura once sang. The rain tapped a gentle rhythm, and Richard watched the city blur beyond the glass, its lights softer now, less demanding. He wasn't a CEO anymore, not a titan, just a man with a screwdriver and a grandson's trust, a daughter's tentative grace. The chair stood beside him, no longer empty, a symbol of a life reclaimed. He'd found his place, not in boardrooms or headlines, but here, in the glow of a single lamp where honor wasn't proclaimed but lived. If you enjoyed Richard's inspiring redemption in the empty chair, hit like to support this story and subscribe for more heartfelt tales. Your support fuels these journeys of honor and family. Thanks for being here.